How's it going, Eliminators? Today we're going to be replacing some rotor bearings on a Yardworks single stage snowblower. So with that being said, let's get right into it. So we have a Yardworks single stage 5 horsepower 21-inch snowblower here. This is ours. We own this and we use it to do sidewalks and little walkways that don't require a 2-stage big snowblower. And today we're just doing some annual maintenance. So at the end of the season we like to go through our equipment and just see what it needs, do the work, and then that way we know for the next season everything starts up and runs just fine. So today we are replacing the bearings on the impeller or the rotor down there. Now it is much easier to remove the bearing on this side than it is to remove the bearing on that side, and that's because the other side has a pulley. However, that pulley threads onto the shaft, and that is why we have the Venom HP out. So we're going to be getting into that shortly, but to remove the bearing from this side, we need to remove the bearing flange, and those are 3 10mm bolts. Once you have those bolts removed, we can pry off our bearing and bearing flange. You guys can see there a little bit of nickel anti-seize on the shaft as well as the bearing here. And this bearing, when you turn it, I can feel it's grabbing, and I don't want that to seize up on me while we're using it. So the only thing that I had removed previously was a bolt and a washer, similar to the Toro, that once the bolt is tightened up, it goes into the shaft there. It pulls the shaft into the bearing. So with the bearing and bearing flange, we are going to put the flange side up and just use a small ball peen hammer to tap the old bearing out of that flange, because we are going to be reusing this flange and just replacing the bearing. Now, when you're in the business that I am in, it's always nice to have spare bearings in your inventory for all kinds of different units and applications. You want to pretty much have a little bit of everything. And today on this specific unit, we are using a 6203 RS, and this has a rubber seal on both sides. Once again, we're using a little bit of Permatex nickel anti-seize to prevent corrosion, and we're just going to be laying that bearing into the flange. Next up, we're going to line up the inner shaft with the bearing there, and then we'll go ahead and slowly snug up the bolts here. So with the shaft lined up to the bearing, when you turn it, the shaft and the bearing should spin together. And then, like I said, there's going to be the washer and the bolt that goes in there to pull the shaft tight up against the bearing. So as you guys could see, the bearing replacement on that side is incredibly simple, but I don't want to put the bolt and the washer in on that side to pull the shaft tight up against that bearing, because we're still going to move on to the other side, and I want to have the ability to move the shaft left and right for the next part of this bearing change. So coming over to the left side of the snowblower here, I've already removed the belt cover, and then I've also removed the belt. Very simple and the same as last week's video. The only difference is this uses a V-belt right around there. So basically on this one, instead of having the pulley held on by a bolt and a Belleville washer, this one's actually threaded. Now the problem is, again, corrosion. So because this whole snowblower is usually buried in snow, those pulleys commonly seize to the shaft, and it's a threaded shaft there. You guys can see that it's wet, and that's because I've been using some PB Blaster here to loosen everything up, and I have the Venom HP induction heating tool out as well. Today we're going to be heating up the pulley so that we can try to remove that pulley from the shaft, because if we go to the inside here, there is a bearing on the inside right there, and we need to remove the pulley in order to get to that. Now this is a 1-inch nut that's on this pulley, and I'm going to show you guys how difficult it is to remove without heat. It absolutely will not come off. Now I should note at this time that the rotor pulley as well as the rotor shaft have what is known as left-hand threads, which means that it's lefty-tighty, righty-loosey. So it's completely backwards from right-hand threads. And whenever you're working on something like this and you don't know you know, what the threads are, whether they're right hand or left hand, you can always look at the way the system is designed to spin. So in this case, if we pulled over the engine, the crankshaft pulley here, the drive pulley, spins counterclockwise, which means it's transferring that counterclockwise motion down to the driven pulley, which is the rotor pulley. And from an engineering standpoint, you would want that pulley to be self-tightening. So lefty-tighty. Now, if you can't figure that out looking at your pulleys, you can always come down to the threads, and I'll try to get good focus here for you guys. But you're gonna notice that the threads are farther in on the left side and farther out on the right side, which would mean you would start threading something on like this, and it would work itself down as you spun it counterclockwise or left-hand thread. So when I'm using my Milwaukee Impact here, I think I was running it on number 2. The light was up. We are tightening it to try to loosen it. And in order for me to work and film at the same time, I've just taken my soft blow hammer and wedged it into the rotor shaft here and the impeller blades, so that as I tighten that to try to loosen the pulley, the rotor shaft spins, it's going to get caught up there. Basically, I don't have to hold it and work the impact at the same time. So like many times before, when I'm using some penetrating fluid and an impact tool, sometimes it's just not enough to free up whatever it is that you're trying to free up, because it's just seized too much. And that is where the mini ductor Venom HP by Induction Innovations comes into play. So once again, we are going to be using induction heat to heat up the nut that is integrated into that pulley. Once we can get some heat to it, it will cause the pulley to expand. So with a little bit of penetrating oil on the pulley, we are going to begin using the mini ductor Venom HP here. So once again, it is inducing a magnetic field to heat up the metal. You're going to notice a little bit of smoke as the penetrating oil cooks off there. Now, once again, we're not trying to get this thing red hot, because the hotter the pulley gets, the hotter the shaft that we're trying to remove the pulley from gets as well. So all we're trying to do is get some quick, direct heat focused on the pulley itself, and try to limit the amount of heat going to the shaft so that only the pulley expands, thus making it a little bit easier to remove. That's the plan anyways. I can feel the heat radiating off of this thing. So it is getting quite hot. Elapsed time, I'm gonna say about a minute and 20 seconds. Try to get a live shot for you guys. Once again, righty position. Number 2, soft blow hammer wedged in there. Oh. So I'll try to get a shot of the inside for you guys. So you can see there is the threads. So I'm going to attempt to get some lubrication into the backside, because that also goes through a bearing. So Venom HP allowed us to get the pulley freed up. That thing was 100% seized before, so a little bit of induction heat works awesome. The only thing is, while I'm loosening this off, it is pushing the shaft farther that way. And I really didn't think of it at the time, but there's holes in this pulley here. The pulley must be held in by a flange so that as I'm loosening it off, the pulley doesn't come off the shaft is coming out of the pulley. So I now have to remove these 3 10mm bolts. All right, so with the inner flange removed, check it out, righty-loosey, and if I can get a shot in here, the pulley is now being removed from the shaft. So now I'll be able to take the pulley off. Today's video is really not structured in any kind of way. You're basically just along for the ride. We're learning how this system works. So threaded piece right there that goes into the bearing. That's part of the pulley, obviously. So now I'm just going to try to remove the bearing from the pulley. Then I can install a new bearing on there and start to get this thing back together. So because the threads there on the pulley are seized into the bearing, the only way I'm going to be able to punch the pulley out of the bearing is by locking the bearing itself by the outer race into the jaws of my vise here, and then I'm going to use an 8mm impact socket to go in to the area where the pulley is, and then I'm going to be hammering on the socket to punch the pulley out of the bearing. Trying to hold the bearing in the vise and punch it out that way. It's not working. So once again, we are going to be cooking a bearing here using the Venom HP. And if I destroy the bearing in the process, no big deal because we're replacing it anyways. But even if I destroyed the outer side of that bearing and I can just get it to the inner race, then I can have a little bit of metal to work with. And if I have to cut away at it, then I'll have to cut away at it. But I'll bring you back, hopefully when this thing's removed, because once I cook this bearing, it is going to get smoky in here. I'm going to have to run this thing over to the vise, give it a hammer, see if it comes off. Alright, so we ended up getting the bearing off of the pulley here. Obviously the bearing was pretty much destroyed. We cut into the outer race to loosen that up, and then once we were able to remove the outer race, then there is the inner race that was seized onto the pulley, and then we were able to remove that as well. Once again, wouldn't have been possible without the Venom HP induction heating tool, because if we used a torch, again, the flames from the torch are going to be deflecting off of whatever it is that you're heating, and we would have been putting quite a bit of heat to the pulley, which again, that's the whole point behind induction heating technology, is if you have something like this, a bearing's inner race that's seized to something like the pulley, when you're using that induction heat, it is heating this up first, and the heat goes to that faster than it does to the inside object, obviously expanding that. So we clean that up with a little bit of emery paper, and I now have a new bearing for this side to install, and we're gonna get this back together. Now, the important thing here is that before we install the bearing, flange, and pulley on the left side of the snowblower, we need to make sure that the shaft is pulled tight to this side of the snowblower here. So I've installed the bolt and the washer there, and that will pull the shaft as far over to this side as it can be. You will see that the inner little bushing there that is welded to the shaft has been pulled tight up against the bearing. Now, obviously we had an issue with the pulley seizing into the bearing, so we are going to be using Permatex nickel anti-seize between the bearing and the pulley itself, and we've used some emery paper, which is fine sandpaper, to make this just a slip fit. So again, we're going to prevent those two from seizing together. But also remember, we had to use the Venom HP to remove the pulley from the threads because the threads were seized. So we will also be using a little bit of Permatex nickel anti-seize on the threads to prevent seizing there. And for how inexpensive Permatex nickel anti-seize is, I pretty much use it all over the place, especially on snowblowers that are going to be prone to rusting and corroding due to all of the snow that melts to water. Moisture creates corrosion. Make sure we coat the threads on the rotor shaft. Now, MTD, who manufactures Yardworks, may have figured out that this bearing could seize to this pulley, and that is why they made the 3 holes in the pulley itself, because imagine if that bearing seized to the pulley and the holes weren't there. We would have had a heck of a time getting the pulley with the seized bearing off of the shaft. So at this point, I really don't have to assemble it the opposite way that I took it apart. I can put the bearing on, flange on, and then thread on the pulley last. The bearing here sits in its own little groove or indentation in the side of the auger housing here. So at this point, I can just go ahead and take the bearing flange and we'll get that installed. I once again have the auger or the rotor here held in place by just my soft blow hammer. So as we tighten the pulley onto the threads of the shaft, the shaft should not spin. You guys can see all the Permatex nickel anti-seize coming out of there. I applied that quite heavily. And then we're gonna go ahead and snug that up with my Milwaukee here, just on number 1. You're not trying to over tighten it, because we have to remember that there's only a very small 3/8 bolt on the other side with a washer holding the shaft that way. So if you start cranking this thing tight, again in a reverse rotation to tighten it, because it is a left-hand thread, you could end up breaking the bolt at that end. So don't quite think of it as, you know, something that you need to over tighten, because again, as soon as you engage the belt with the idler from the engine, this pulley is self-tightening, so it will always tighten itself up. So you guys just want to go little by little, but I wanted to show you guys how I knew how much to tighten it up, and I'll show you how much threads are sticking out there. So if we go to the inside of the housing here, the shaft must come in contact with the bearing, which it is now. So you really don't want to tighten it up any more past that, because then you're going to be basically closing the auger housing sides in on the rotor shaft. And it probably could get to the point where it's so tight that it puts a lot of pressure against the small 3/8 bolt on that side. So basically, as soon as both of the shaft ends are coming in contact with the bearing there on either side, that is pretty much as tight as you want to go. As for right now though, I can take out the soft blow hammer and pretty much just check, and this thing spins nice and easy. Check that out. Very smooth. There's no grinding or binding, which that was the issue before with the bearing here. And then I figured, you know, if I'm replacing that one, might as well do this one over here, which ended up leading to, you know, the Venom HP and having to kind of unseize things. But yeah, this repair went quite well. And then off camera, we also installed a new auger cable here. So that's going to be a Sten's 290213. And then we also installed a new primer bulb right there, because the old primer bulb, these are just basically rubber, and as they age, the rubber kind of gets a little harder. So what happens is you try to prime it and it doesn't move as much. So now you get full range of motion, so you can prime it properly. And that part number is going to be a 120925 primer bulb, once again from Sten. So I'll get the belt here. Now, when looking at the IPL, or illustrated parts listing, I wanted to point out that there are going to be 2 different diagrams for the same machine. The only difference is going to be one has a 4-cycle engine and one has a 2-cycle engine. So 4-stroke being straight gas and 2-stroke being premix. And there are going to be a couple differences coming over to the 4-cycle one. There are going to be these bushings here that go on the end of the rotor or auger shaft there, number 49 and 50. And if we come over to the 2-stroke one and look at the rotor shaft here, you guys can see that this one does not have those bushings, so it just goes bearing to bearing. However, if we go over to the other side of the rotor shaft or auger shaft, they just show you the washers and the bolt there. They don't show you the bearing over here, which is weird. So number 34 is the bearing. That's going to be an MTD 741-04188, and I believe the new part number lists a letter A at the end of it, and I just ended up having those 6203 RS bearings in stock. They were just generic bearings, so they weren't necessarily MTD ones. And then as for the belts, there's actually going to be 2 different belts depending on which engine you have. So we'll start out with this. If you have a 3.5 horsepower Tecumseh, you are going to need the 754-0367, which measures out to a 3/8 by 34.4 inch long belt. Now, if you have the 2 or the 5 horsepower variant, which is what I have, it is going to require a 754-0101A, which they have measured out to be 1/2 by 35 inch long. Now, this is where things get a little weird. I have in front of me a 1/2 by 35 inch long belt that ended up being way too tight to fit onto this snowblower here. So I'm going to bring you over to the snowblower and we're going to have a look at what I installed instead. So the belt that I ended up installing measured out to be a 1/2 by 35.7, and it might look like there's quite a bit of slack on the bottom end there, but I want to show you something. When I go to engage this, there is full tension on the belt at the point where the lever is snug up against the handle there. Now that is an MTD belt. It is a 954-04204. It measures, like I said, 1/2 by 35.7, and I couldn't really figure out what was going on until I removed and measured the old belt, and check it out. This belt here, guys, measures 35.75. So that's a little bit longer than the belt that I just installed. So not too sure why a 1/2 by 35 wouldn't fit, but this fits just fine. And I know it looks like this is a little weird how the belt is hitting the tire, but you have to remember that belt guard goes on, and that'll act as a belt guide, and that'll kind of end up being like that. Now, in order to install the belt cover, I've just used my quick clamp there to hold the auger engage lever up against the handlebars. You guys can see belt is tight. Like I said, I'm installing a belt that's a little bit longer than the one I'm supposed to install, but a little bit shorter than the one that I just took off that I knew worked just fine. The big thing is that you want to make sure there's a little bit of a gap here between the two belts, which there is. If I have to go a little bit shorter so it pulls that idler arm or pulley up a little bit, then I will. You know, I don't really know what's happened here with the belts not working. Sometimes this happens. Someone could have installed a slightly smaller diameter idler pulley, which would cause it to go down further, and then, you know, that changes your belt lengths as well. But everything seems proper here, so we're just going to put it together and see what happens. I also wanted to show you guys, check this out. Those are Robinson screws, and they are not OEM from MTD. So clearly, like I said, someone's worked on this before. So now that this unit is back together, I'm going to be taking it outside, firing it up, and running it on some Gulf Pro Fuels Alkylate 2-stroke engineered fuel. This stuff is good to last for 2 years once the container has been opened, or up to 5 years on a shelf with an unopened container. So as the seasons transition from winter to spring, we just got a snowstorm, but I know that this snow won't last long. So once I put this into the engine, at least I know that once the snow melts and I store this thing in my shed, it'll fire up first or second pull next year. All right, so snowstorm's coming in, a couple primes, put this thing on full choke. Well, that's going to be it for today's video. If you guys enjoyed it, think about leaving me a thumbs up. You know, it really helps me out. You can click here to subscribe and click over here to watch one of my previous videos. I upload every single week, so be sure to stop on by next week, check channel out for new content. And as always, guys, thanks for watching.